Gavin Brooks slammed his mop bucket against the hallway wall, water splashing across polished floors. No one would ever thank him for cleaning, and pushed open the engineering lab door without knocking. Every head turned, every jaw tightened. "I know what's wrong with your system," he said quietly. The laughter started before he finished the sentence. He was a janitor, a white guy in a gray uniform who smelled like bleach and floor wax. Nobody asked his name. Nobody needed to. But here's what none of them knew that night. The man holding the mop had once built systems more sophisticated than anything in that room. And he was about to prove it. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you want to find out what happened next. The clock on the wall of Mercer Dynamics' fourth-floor engineering lab read 11:47 p.m. when the whole thing came apart. So, not slowly, not with warning signs that a careful man might have caught early. It came apart the way a bridge collapses. One moment it's holding everything, the next, there's nothing but noise and falling. Bensham, the AI system that Mercer Dynamics had staked its entire future on a $100 million defense contract with the United States Department of Defense, had just thrown a cascade failure across 17 interconnected nodes. Monitors flickered. Alert windows piled on top of each other like cars in a freeway accident. 3 senior engineers were on their feet, shouting over each other, pointing at different screens, each one absolutely certain the problem was somewhere else, somewhere the other guy was responsible for. Jason Marlowe, the head of the systems integration team, stood at the center of it all with his sleeves rolled up and his face the color of a brick. He had 12 years at Mercer, 2 advanced degrees framed on the wall of his corner office, a salary that cleared 6 figures before bonuses, and right now, at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, not a single useful idea in his head. Reroute through the backup cluster. He snapped at the engineer closest to the keyboard. Already tried that, Jason. 3 times. Then try it again. It's not the cluster. I know what it is, Davis. Just do what I'm telling you. Nobody noticed the man in the hallway. Samir. He wasn't supposed to be noticed. That was in a very real sense the entire job description. You came in when the building was quiet. You cleaned what needed cleaning. You fixed what needed fixing in the physical world. A broken floor tile, a leaking pipe, a trash can, nobody thought to empty, and then you disappeared before the important people arrived in the morning. You were infrastructure, like the wiring in the walls. Gavin Brooks had been working the night shift at Mercer Dynamics for 14 months. He was 41 years old, 6 feet even, with the kind of build that comes not from a gym, but from actual physical labor, broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle hands that were rough in the way hands get rough when they work for a living. He kept his brown hair short and his face clean-shaven because Lena had told him once that she liked it better that way, and what Lena said carried weight in his world. He had stopped his cart outside the engineering lab because the noise coming through the door was different from the noise he usually heard at this hour. Most nights, the engineers who worked late were the focused kind, quiet, concentrated, the kind of people who put headphones on and disappeared into their screens. This noise was panicked. Gavin had heard panicked before in a different life, in a different building, and his body recognized it before his mind caught up. He leaned his mop against the wall and looked through the narrow window in the door. The screens told him everything he needed to know in about 8 seconds. He stood there for a moment, just thinking, processing, running through the architecture in his head the way he used to do back when running through architecture in his head was something people actually paid him to do. He saw the failure point immediately, not because he was showing off, not because he was looking for it, but because it was obvious to him in the way that a wrong note is obvious to a musician. Something in the synchronization layer was sending conflicting authentication tokens to the primary node cluster. The backup rerouting wasn't working because the backup was receiving the same corrupted instruction set. The whole thing was chasing its own tail. He pushed the door open. The room didn't go quiet right away. It took a few seconds for people to register that the door had opened, that someone had walked in, who didn't belong there. that the someone was wearing a gray maintenance uniform with a small Mercer Dynamics logo stitched on the chest pocket. Bow. Jason Marlowe turned around last. His eyes moved up and down Gavin's uniform with the particular expression of a man who had never once in his adult life had to wonder whether he was being taken seriously. "Can I help you with something?" Jason said. The tone made clear that the correct answer was, "No, you have the wrong room, let yourself out." "I think I can see what's wrong," Gavin said. 3 engineers exchanged glances. One of them, a young woman named Reyes, who was newer to the team and had not yet learned the particular cruelty of group contempt, looked at Gavin with something that was almost curiosity. Jason didn't look curious. Jason looked like a man who had just been told his shoelaces were untied by someone he considered beneath him. "You think you can see what's wrong?" he repeated. "Yes." "With this system?" "Yes. This classified defense AI integration system that you—" Jason paused, looking at the cart visible through the still-open door. Mop floors around. Someone behind Jason made a sound. It was the beginning of a laugh, swallowed just in time to be deniable. Gavin didn't flinch. He had gotten very good at not flinching. "I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes. I just—" "Then don't." Jason turned back to his screens. "Close the door on your way out." Gavin looked at the screens again. He could see the counter ticking in the corner of one monitor, a session timer probably tied to a demonstration protocol. He didn't know exactly what deadline they were working against, but the number was moving, and the expressions in the room suggested they didn't have time to waste. He didn't leave. "Your synchronization layer," he said, "is generating conflicting auth tokens. They're hitting your primary cluster with instructions that contradict each other, and when your team reroutes to back up, the same corrupted instruction set follows because it's upstream of the reroute decision. You need to isolate the sync process, flush the token queue, and reissue clean credentials before you reinitialize the cluster connection." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people listening. The sharp, sudden quiet of people who have just heard something they didn't expect and don't quite know what to do with. Jason turned around slowly. "What did you just say?" Gavin said it again, slower this time in case it helped. "Bossy." For a moment, nobody moved. Then, Davis, the engineer at the keyboard, leaned forward and started looking at exactly the part of the system Gavin had described. His fingers slowed down, stopped. He stared at the screen. "Jason," he said carefully, the token queue is—" "I can see what it is, Davis." It's exactly what he said. Jason's jaw tightened. "We would have found it. Sure, Davis said. He wasn't looking at Jason anymore. He was looking at Gavin. "But we didn't." Gavin stepped to the keyboard. Nobody invited him. Nobody stopped him either, which in that room at that moment was essentially the same thing as an invitation. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a quiet confidence that had nothing performative about it. He wasn't showing off. He was just doing the thing that needed doing, the same way he would fix a leaking pipe or replace a broken floor tile. You see the problem. You fix the problem. You move on. Dummy. 4 minutes and 53 seconds later, the cascade failure cleared. Every monitor stabilized. The alert windows closed one by one. The counter in the corner kept running, but now it was counting something that worked. The room was very, very quiet. Gavin stepped back from the keyboard. He looked at the screens for a moment, confirming what he already knew, and then he turned toward the door. "You're welcome to check my work," he said, "and I'm sorry for interrupting." He walked out, picked up his mop, kept moving. Behind him in the engineering lab, nobody spoke for almost 30 seconds. Finally, Reyes said very quietly, "Who is that guy?" Jason didn't answer. His face had closed down into something flat and unreadable, the expression of a man recalculating, reassessing, deciding something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Davis was already pulling up Gavin's employee profile on his secondary monitor. His name is Gavin Brooks, he said. Night shift maintenance. Been here 14 months. He paused, reading further. That's it. That's all there is. What he didn't find, what none of them would find without looking considerably harder, was everything that had come before the 14 months. Sloan Mercer had been awake since 4 that morning. She was 53 years old and had run Mercer Dynamics for 11 of those years, which meant she had a very precise understanding of exactly what a $100 million defense contract looked like when it was about to fall apart. She had watched the cascade failure happen through the security feed on her laptop from her home office, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, a cup of coffee going cold beside her keyboard. She had watched the engineers scramble. She had watched Jason Marlowe perform his version of leadership, which was mostly loud and directional and not particularly effective. She had watched the door open and the man in the maintenance uniform walk in. She had watched all of it. She picked up her phone and called her head of security. The maintenance worker in Lab 4, night shift. Pull everything you have on him and have it on my desk by 7. Yes, ma'am. She set the phone down and looked at the frozen frame on her laptop screen. Gavin Brooks, standing at the keyboard, his back to the camera, his posture entirely calm, while the rest of the room fell apart around him. Sloan Mercer had not built a $300 million defense company by ignoring things that didn't fit the pattern. The file was on her desk at 6:52 a.m. She read it twice. The first time she read it like a document. The second time she read it like a story, which is what it actually was, though nobody had told it that way before. Gavin Thomas Brooks, age 41, night shift maintenance, Mercer Dynamics 14 months. Prior to that, 8 months driving for a logistics company. Prior to that, 6 months working at a hardware store in Annandale, Virginia. Prior to that. And here the file shifted completely, the way a road shifts when you cross a state line. Dr. Gavin T. Brooks, research associate, MIT Lincoln Laboratory, specializing in adaptive neural architecture for autonomous defense systems. Published author. Patent holder. Cleared for work at the TS/SCI level. And then 7 years ago, a single line in the file that explained everything. Wife Elaine Margaret Brooks, née Calloway. Deceased. Sloan set the file down on her desk. She took off her reading glasses. She looked out the window at the Mercer Dynamics parking lot, where the morning shift was just beginning to arrive. 7 years. 7 years between the man who had been at the cutting edge of adaptive defense AI and the man who pushed a mop through the hallways of her building at midnight. She was experienced enough to know that 7 years could contain an entire lifetime. An entire collapse and reconstruction of a person. She picked up the phone again. Get me an address for Gavin Brooks, home address, and find out what time his shift ends. His shift ended at 6. He was at Lena's school by 7:15. That was the routine, had been for years. He worked through the night, got home as the sun came up, slept for a few hours, and was at the school gates to pick up his daughter when the bell rang. No exceptions. Not for overtime. Not for schedule changes. Not for anything. Lena was 7 years old with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin and a laugh that could fill a room. She had her backpack on before most of her classmates had finished packing theirs because she knew her dad would be there and she didn't want to make him wait. He never made her wait either. They walked home most days, even when it was cold, because Lena liked to stop at the bookstore 2 blocks from school and look at the science books in the window. She wasn't old enough for most of them yet, but Gavin would crouch down beside her and explain what the pictures meant, and she would ask questions that were either very simple or impossibly complex, and he would answer all of them. That afternoon, walking home with Lena's hand in his, her backpack bumping against her shoulders with each step, Gavin felt the day behind him receding, the way days always did once he was with her. The lab, the engineers, the silence that had followed his 4 minutes and 53 seconds at the keyboard. It all became smaller. "Dad," Lena said. "Yeah." If you found out that a machine was making a mistake because it was getting confused by its own instructions, what would you do? Gavin looked at her sideways. Where did that come from? We talked about computers at school today. She shrugged the way 7-year-olds shrug enormously theatrically. Mrs. Okafor said computers don't make mistakes, they just do what they're told. But I said, what if what they're told is wrong? What did Mrs. Okafor say to that? She said that was a good point. Lena looked pleased with herself. So what would you do? Gavin thought about it for half a block. I'd find where the wrong instructions were coming from, he said. And I'd clear them out. Start clean. Lena nodded seriously. Like when you restart my tablet. Pretty much exactly like that. That's what I said too, she told him. Mrs. Okafor said I was very smart. Mrs. Okafor is right, Gavin said. Lena squeezed his hand once satisfied, and they kept walking. He found the business card slipped under his apartment door when they got home. Mercer Dynamics letterhead, gold embossed, Sloan Mercer, Chief Executive Officer. On the back in neat handwriting, Mr. Brooks, I'd like to speak with you. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. My office. SM. Gavin stood in the doorway for a long moment, the card in his hand, Lena already inside pulling off her shoes. Dad, what's that? A note, he said. From who? He turned the card over in his fingers. From work. Good work or bad work? He thought about the Cascade failure, about Jason Marlowe's face, about the silence that had filled the room when the monitors cleared. I don't know yet, he said honestly. He put the card on the kitchen counter and started making dinner. He arrived at Sloan Mercer's office at 8:58. He was wearing the nicest clothes he owned that weren't his work uniform, which meant dark slacks and a button-down shirt that was slightly too formal for most things, and slightly not formal enough for a CEO's corner office. He had shaved carefully. He had combed his hair. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who was doing his best with what he had. Her assistant showed him in without a wait. Sloan Mercer was standing at the window when he entered, not sitting behind her desk, a deliberate choice he recognized. She turned when he came in, and her eyes were the sharp, direct kind that assessed and filed without making it obvious they were doing so. Mr. Brooks, she said, thank you for coming. Ms. Mercer. He stood in the center of the room, not sure whether to sit. Nobody had offered. Please. She gestured to the chairs in front of her desk and took her own seat. She had a file in front of her, his file he assumed, though she didn't open it. I'm going to be direct with you because I think direct is probably what you're used to. That works for me, he said. I watched the security footage from Lab 4 last night. She let that sit for a moment. All of it. Okay. I also pulled your personnel file. Your complete personnel file. She paused again. And then I looked at what was in the DoD research database before that. Gavin was quiet. Dr. Brooks, she said. He hadn't been called that in 7 years. Something in his chest moved in a way he didn't entirely expect. I go by Gavin, he said after a beat. Gavin. She nodded, accepting the correction. I want to know why. I want to know the whole story if you're willing to tell me. And then, I want to make you an offer. He looked at her for a long moment. He was good at reading rooms. He had learned that skill back when reading rooms meant something different, when the rooms were full of generals and government officials and engineers who had entire careers riding on decisions made in under an hour. He was reading this room now. She wasn't performing. She wasn't managing him. She was genuinely asking. That more than anything was what made him answer. My wife died, he said. Her name was Elaine. She died when Lena was born. He said it the way he always said it, now steadily, without the collapse that had defined the first 2 years. The grief was still there. It had just found its shape. She was the plan. We had a plan together, and when she was gone, the plan didn't make sense anymore. Sloan didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. People said they were sorry so automatically that the words had worn smooth like river stones. The work I was doing, he continued, was all-consuming. It always had been. Elaine understood that. She was part of what made it possible to do it that way. Without her... He stopped, started again. Lena needed a father who was actually there, not one who sent emails from a lab at midnight. I couldn't do both. I chose her. Sloan was quiet for a moment. And the maintenance work. Steady hours. Night shift means I can pick her up from school. The benefits cover her pediatrician and her dentist. He looked at his hands briefly. It was what made sense. You've been solving complex AI architecture problems in your head for 14 months while you cleaned our floors. Some of them, he said. The good puzzles I work through when things are slow. Something moved across Sloan Mercer's face that he couldn't quite name. Last night, she said, when you walked into that lab, what made you decide to go in? Gavin thought about it. The noise, he said. When a system is failing, and the people responsible for it don't know why the noise has a particular quality. Panic without direction. I recognized it. From where? From being in that position myself, he said. A long time ago. She nodded slowly. Then she opened the desk drawer and placed a document on the table between them. I'd like to bring you on as a project consultant for the DoD contract. Not maintenance. Engineering consulting at a rate commensurate with your experience and your qualifications. She slid the document forward. The terms are on page 1. He didn't pick it up immediately. There'll be pushback, he said. Considerable pushback, she agreed. Jason Marlowe will make your life very unpleasant. I know the type. I imagine you do. She held his gaze. Are you interested? He thought about Lena. About the bookstore window, and the science books, and the questions that were either very simple or impossibly complex. About a 7-year-old who had already figured out that when a machine gets confused by its own instructions, you find the source and you clear it out. Start clean. What are the hours? He asked. And for the first time since he'd walked into her office, Sloan Mercer smiled. The offer was sitting on his kitchen counter that night next to Lena's homework folder and a half-empty box of cereal she'd knocked over that morning, and he hadn't gotten around to standing back up. He hadn't signed it yet. He'd read it 4 times. Knew every line of it. The compensation was more than he'd earned in any single year at MIT, which was saying something. The role was described as Senior Systems Consultant, Adaptive AI Integration. Language that fit him the way a tailored jacket fits a man who'd been wearing someone else's clothes for 7 years. The hours were flexible pending project demands. Pending project demands. That was the phrase that kept stopping him. He knew what defense contract project demands looked like. He'd lived inside them. 16-hour days were standard. Weekends disappeared. Holidays became negotiable. He'd done it willingly once because Elaine had been there, because they'd been building something together, because the sacrifices had felt like deposits into a shared account that was going to pay out someday. Someday had never come. He looked at the document. He looked at the cereal box. He picked up the cereal box and stood it upright, and then went to check on Lena. She was asleep in the way only children sleep, completely without reservation. Her face slack and soft and younger than it looked when she was awake and asking impossible questions. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He didn't go in. He just stood there and looked at her and felt the particular weight of being the only person in the world who was responsible for her. He went back to the kitchen and signed the document. Midnight. Because the alternative was walking back into that building tomorrow night with a mop, and he couldn't do that anymore. Not after last night. Not after he'd seen the problem in 8 seconds and fixed it in under 5 minutes, and then walked back out into the hallway like none of it had happened. He'd been able to do that for 14 months because there was a wall between who he used to be and who he was now. And last night someone had walked up to that wall and knocked a hole straight through it. And he folded the document, put it in an envelope, set his alarm for 6:30. Thus. Then he sat at the kitchen table for a while and thought about Elaine. Not with the drowning grief of the early years, but with the quiet, aching clarity that had replaced it. He thought about what she would have said. She had been practical in the way genuinely optimistic people are practical. She believed things would work out, but she also believed you had to do the work to make them work out. She wouldn't have told him to play it safe. She never had. "Okay," he said quietly to the empty kitchen. "Okay." He went to bed. He didn't sleep much. He walked into Mercer Dynamics at 9:15 the next morning through the front entrance, not the side door by the loading dock where the maintenance staff clocked in. The lobby felt different from that angle. Bigger. The ceilings were higher than he'd noticed, or maybe he'd just never looked up before. Sloane's assistant, a composed young man named Marcus, who seemed to have been born already knowing exactly where everything was met, him at the security desk, and walked him up to the 4th floor to a glass-walled conference room that looked out over the engineering bay. Gavin sat down. Marcus brought coffee without being asked, which Gavin appreciated, and told him Ms. Mercer would be in shortly. She wasn't. Instead, the door opened 6 minutes later, and Jason Marlowe walked in. He was alone. He was wearing a jacket which Gavin had not seen him wear the previous night. He stood inside the door for a moment without saying anything, taking in the situation, Gavin sitting at the conference table with a coffee cup, the way a man takes stock of a room he thought he owned and has just found occupied. "She tell you to come in," Jason said. "Yes, and you brought your..." He glanced at the coffee cup, made a small dismissive gesture. "You just made yourself comfortable." "Marcus brought the coffee," Gavin said. He kept his voice neutral, unchallenging. He'd learned early that with men like Jason, anything that sounded like a counter-move became a reason to escalate. "I assume you know why I'm here." "I know what she told you." Jason walked to the far side of the table, not sitting, just standing with his hands in his pockets. "I want to know if you understand what that actually means." "She offered me a consulting role on the DoD contract. I accepted." "You fixed a token queue error," Jason said. "At midnight. In a lab you weren't authorized to enter." He let that land. "That's not a consulting resume. That's trespassing that happened to go well." Gavin looked at him. "The system would have failed. We would have found it. Your demonstration window was 14 hours away. We would have found it." Jason repeated louder this time, the way people repeat things when they're not making an argument, but staking a position. He leaned forward slightly. "I want to be very clear with you about something. Whatever she's told you about this opportunity, whatever you're imagining this looks like from the outside, this is a classified defense project with security protocols and clearance requirements and a team that has been working together for 2.5 years. You can't walk in off a mop shift and contribute to that. I held a TS/SCI clearance for 6 years, Gavin said quietly. Something crossed Jason's face, surprise quickly controlled. That was 7 years ago. The architecture hasn't changed as much as people think. The protocols have. Then I'll learn the protocols. Jason straightened up. He looked at Gavin for a long moment, really looked the way he probably should have looked the night before and hadn't. Something was recalibrating behind his eyes. Gavin recognized it. He'd seen it in academic settings, in research labs, in government briefing rooms. It was the expression of a smart man trying to figure out whether he was looking at a threat. I've spent 2.5 years on this project, Jason said. His voice was quieter now, which paradoxically made it worse. My team has spent 2.5 years on this project. We are days away from a final demonstration that will either secure this contract or end it. And she wants to bring in... He stopped himself, recalibrated. Someone who hasn't been in an active research environment in 7 years, who doesn't know this system, who fixed one problem and walked out. I'm not here to take your team's work, Gavin said. I'm here to help you get through the demonstration. I don't need your help. The door opened. Sloan Mercer walked in, read the room in about half a second, and sat down at the head of the table, without commenting on what she'd clearly interrupted. "Jason," she said, "thank you for coming." "You didn't tell me he'd be here. I'm telling you now." She placed a folder on the table. "I've reviewed the failure analysis from last night. The synchronization error that Gavin identified has been present in the system logs for 11 days. 11 days, Jason. We have the timestamps." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence, the kind with weight. "It was an edge case interaction," Jason started. "It was in the logs," Sloan said. "Not unkindly, just with precision. Which means it should have been caught during routine diagnostic review." She looked at him steadily. "We have 48 hours before the demonstration. I need every resource we have pointed at making this work. That includes Gavin." Jason looked at the folder, then at Gavin, then at Sloan. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I make them sometimes," she said pleasantly. "This isn't one of them." Jason walked out without another word. The door didn't slam, which was almost more impressive. It took real effort to not slam a door when everything in you wanted to. Sloan looked at Gavin. "That went about how I expected." "He's not entirely wrong," Gavin said. She raised an eyebrow. "He built something real," Gavin said. "I'm coming in at the end of a 2.5-year process, and I don't know the full architecture. He's right that there's a learning curve." He picked up his coffee. "He's wrong about the timeline. I can be useful in 48 hours. But I wanted to say it because he's not entirely wrong." Sloan studied him for a moment. Most people who want to establish credibility don't start by agreeing with the person who just tried to run them out of the room. "Most people are trying to win the argument," Gavin said. "I'm trying to make the demonstration work." She held his gaze for a beat. "All right," she said. "Let's get you up to speed." The engineering team's reaction ran the full spectrum. Ed Davis, who had been at the keyboard the night before and had seen the fix happen in real time, was openly welcoming the genuine, slightly over-enthusiastic welcome of a person who was relieved someone competent had arrived. He pulled up system schematics before Gavin had even finished his first walkthrough. Talking fast, asking questions, treating Gavin from the first minute as a colleague rather than an anomaly. Reyes watched from a careful distance for the first hour and then started asking technical questions that were sharper than they sounded, the kind of questions designed to find out how deep the knowledge actually went. Gavin answered all of them. After the fourth answer, she pulled her chair closer and stopped watching from a distance. The rest of the team fell somewhere in between, ranging from politely skeptical to actively avoidant. One engineer, a heavy-set man named Pritchard, who had been with Jason's team since the beginning, didn't speak to Gavin at all for the first 4 hours. He just worked loudly and demonstratively, making it clear through sheer visible effort that he didn't need whatever Gavin was supposedly there to offer. Jason was gone for most of the morning. When he came back after lunch, he went straight to his own workstation and didn't address the team meeting where Gavin had spent 90 minutes going through his analysis of the current architecture. He just sat down, pulled up his own screens, and started working in parallel a silent, pointed declaration of independence. Gavin didn't push it. He kept his head down. He asked questions when he needed information and offered observations only when they were directly relevant. He was building a map in his head of the system, how the pieces connected, where the stress points were, which design decisions were elegant, and which were compromises that had been made under deadline pressure and then never revisited. There were several of those. More than he would have expected from a team this calibrated. But 2.5 years was a long time, and under pressure, even the best teams sometimes bolted things together with wire and called it architecture. Around 3 in the afternoon, Davis rolled his chair over with a printout. "Okay, can I show you something?" "Yeah. This is the handshake protocol between the decision layer and the output validation module." He spread the printout on the table between them. "We've had intermittent response latency on this for about 6 weeks. It's within tolerance, so nobody's flagged it as critical, but in a live demonstration environment with military observers running active queries. "It'll show up," Gavin said. "That's what I think. Jason says it's within spec." Gavin looked at this printout. He could see it immediately, the same way he'd seen the token queue problem the night before, without effort, without ceremony. The handshake was waiting too long on a confirmation signal before proceeding. It was a conservative design choice probably made early in development when the team was more worried about false positives than response time. It made sense in isolation. In a live demonstration where military observers were actively testing reaction speed, it would look like hesitation, like uncertainty. "Has anyone proposed a fix?" Gavin asked. "I put a note in the shared doc 4 weeks ago," Davis said. "Jason closed it. Said we were too close to delivery to be changing validated architecture." Gavin was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong about the risk." "No, but he's also not wrong that it'll show up under pressure." Davis lowered his voice. "I'm not asking you to go around him. I wanted someone else to see it. Someone who could tell me if I'm overthinking it." "You're not overthinking it," Gavin said. Davis let out a breath. Okay, so what do? We document it clearly. We present it to Sloan and Jason together. We make the case for a targeted adjustment, not a redesign, just a threshold tweak on the confirmation signal. 45 minutes of work, maybe an hour. Low risk if we scope it right. "Jason will fight it." "Probably," Gavin said. "But if we walk in with clear documentation and a scoped solution, he'll have to fight the data instead of just fighting me. That's a different argument." Davis looked at him. "You've been here 8 hours." "I've had this argument before," Gavin said. "Just in different rooms." Davis almost smiled. "Different rooms with the same kind of people." "There's only a few kinds of people," Gavin said. They spent the next 2 hours building the documentation. Gavin walked Davis through the analysis, let Davis write most of it in his own voice, because it would land better coming from someone the team already knew and trusted, and added his own technical framing, where Davis's instincts needed sharper language. When they were done, Davis leaned back and read through the full document one more time. "This is good," he said. "This is actually really good. Send it to Sloan tonight," Gavin said. "Copy Jason. He's going to lose it." "He might." Gavin started gathering his notes. "But the demonstration is in 36 hours, and right now the latency issue is on record as a known concern with no action taken. If we flag it now and propose a solution, we're doing our jobs. If we don't flag it, and it shows up tomorrow in front of the military observers..." Davis finished the sentence. "Then it's on us." "Then it's on all of us," Gavin said. "Which is worse?" Davis sent the document at 6:47 that evening. Jason called Davis's cell phone at 7:03. Gavin was in the parking lot about to get into his car to pick up Lena from the neighbor who watched her on evenings when his schedule ran long. He didn't hear the call. He didn't need to. He could reconstruct it well enough from the silence that followed the quiet of a team holding its breath. Then he picked up Lena. She had a drawing she'd made at his neighbor, Mrs. Carpenter's house. A house with a big sun above it, and 2 stick figures in front. One tall and one small, and underneath in Lena's careful 7-year-old handwriting, the words, "Me and Dad." He folded it very carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "Good day," he asked her. "Mrs. Carpenter taught me to play Go Fish," she told him. "I won every time." "Every time. She let me win," Lena said confidentially. "But I still won." He laughed. Genuine, unguarded the laugh that only came out around her. "Yeah," he said. "That counts." They walked home under a sky going orange and purple at the edges, Lena talking about Go Fish and whether fish could actually play games if they were smart enough, and Gavin listened and answered, and let the rest of it, the document, the call Jason's voice at 7:03, fall back to where it belonged. Tomorrow would be what it was. Tonight, he was just her dad. The email arrived at 11:42 that night when Gavin was asleep. He didn't see it until 5:15 the next morning when his alarm went off and he reached for his phone out of habit. It was from Jason Marlowe, sent to the full project team, Sloan Mercer, and 3 members of the executive board. The subject line read, "Concerns regarding unauthorized architecture modifications." Gavin sat up, read it carefully, read it again. Hi. Jason had taken the latency documentation, the careful scoped 2-hour document that Gavin and Davis had built, and reframed it in the email as evidence that Gavin was attempting to make unauthorized changes to validated production architecture less than 24 hours before a critical government demonstration. He didn't lie exactly. He used the right words in the wrong order, emphasized the wrong parts. Let implication do the work that direct accusation couldn't. It was skillfully done. Gavin had to give him that. At the bottom of the email Jason had written, "I strongly recommend that Mr. Brooks's access to the system be suspended, pending a formal review of his qualifications and his understanding of our security protocols." Gavin set the phone down on his nightstand. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a moment, feeling something move through him that wasn't quite anger. Anger was hot. This was colder, more clarifying. He had 32 hours before the demonstration. He had a latency issue that needed a targeted fix. He had a team that was watching to see what happened next, and whatever happened next was going to tell them everything they needed to know about whether Gavin Brooks was someone worth standing behind. He got up, made coffee, made Lena's lunch for the day, packed her backpack while she was still asleep because she always forgot her library book, and he always remembered. Then he sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and typed a reply to Jason's email. Not to the team, not to the board, just to Jason directly. "Jason, I understand your concerns. I should have spoken with you directly before Davis sent that document to Sloan, and I didn't. That was my mistake, and I own it. The latency issue is real, and the proposed fix is scoped and low risk, but you're the lead architect, and you should have been the first conversation, not an email recipient. If you're willing to look at the data together this morning, before the demonstration prep begins, I think we can resolve this in under an hour. My goal is the same as yours. Make the demonstration work." When he sent it, put his phone in his pocket, went to wake up Lena. The reply came while he was making her breakfast. 3 words. "Don't be late." Gavin read it, set the phone face down on the counter, flipped Lena's pancake. "Dad," she said from the table. "Yeah. Is everything okay?" He looked at her. 7 years old, dark eyes her mother's face. The most important thing in his world, eating a pancake on a Wednesday morning like it was the most ordinary thing, which was precisely why it mattered. "Everything's fine," he said. And he meant it. Not because the situation was fine. The situation was complicated and sharp-edged and about to get sharper. But fine was about more than situations. Fine was about the thing underneath the situation that didn't move, the thing that had kept him standing through 7 years of harder mornings than this one. He was still here. Lena was still here. Everything else was solvable. He dropped her at school at 7:50, kissed the top of her head, watched her run through the gate with her backpack bouncing, and then turned and walked back to his car and drove to Mercer Dynamics. Jason was already there, waiting. Jason was waiting in the small conference room off the main engineering bay, not the glass-walled one where Sloan had introduced Gavin to the team 2 days ago. This one had no windows. The door was already closed when Gavin arrived. Jason had chosen that detail deliberately, and Gavin noticed it the same way he noticed everything, quietly, without comment, filing it away. He opened the door and walked in. Jason was sitting with his arms crossed, a laptop open in front of him, 3 printed pages spread across the table. He didn't say good morning. Gavin didn't either. Some mornings don't deserve the formality. "Close the door," Jason said. Gavin closed it, sat down across from him, waited. "I want you to explain to me," Jason said, "exactly what you thought you were doing with that document." "I explained it in the email." The email where you admitted you went around me. Jason's voice was flat and controlled, not the loud performative hostility of the day before. This was quieter, which made it more serious. Davis has been on my team for 18 months. He knows the protocol. You walked in here 2 days ago, and in 48 hours, you've already convinced one of my engineers to file an unauthorized architecture change report, less than 36 hours before a government demonstration. It wasn't unauthorized, Gavin said. It was documented. There's a difference. You don't get to define the difference. That's my job. Your job, Gavin said carefully, is to make the demonstration succeed. If the latency issue surfaces during active military testing, I know what happens if it surfaces. Jason's jaw tightened. I've been managing this project for 2.5 years. I know every risk in this system. I know every trade-off we made and why we made it. You have been here for 2 days. He leaned forward. 2 days. And you're sitting there telling me about risks I already know. Then why is the latency issue still open? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Jason didn't answer immediately. He looked at the printed pages in front of him. Something shifted in his posture, barely a degree the way a building shifts before you can hear it, and Gavin caught it. It was within acceptable parameters, Jason said finally. It was within acceptable parameters for internal testing, Gavin said. Military observers running live queries under demonstration conditions is a different load profile. You know that. I said I know the risks. Then help me understand why the fix isn't already done. Another silence. This one had a different quality than the first. Less confrontational, more tired. Jason picked up one of the printed pages, looked at it, set it back down. Because every change this close to delivery is a potential failure point, he said. Because one targeted fix that goes wrong at 10:30 tomorrow morning in front of DoD representatives doesn't just cost us the contract, it ends the company. He looked at Gavin directly for the first time since he'd walked in. That's the calculation, not negligence, not ignorance, calculated risk management. And Gavin understood that. He genuinely did. He'd made those calculations himself years ago in different rooms with different stakes. And Jason wasn't wrong. Change introduced under pressure was inherently higher risk than the problem it was solving. The fix Davis and I scoped is 2 lines of code, Gavin said. Threshold adjustment on the confirmation signal. 45 minutes of work, 4 hours of testing. We have 34 hours. You're assuming the adjustment doesn't cascade. I've run the dependency analysis. It won't. You've run it in 2 days on a system that took 2.5 years to build. I've run it on systems like it for 6 years, Gavin said, and I can show you every step of the analysis if you want to check my work. I'm not asking you to take this on faith. I'm asking you to look at the data. Jason stared at him. It was a long stare, the kind that isn't really about seeing the other person, but about making a decision you haven't finished making yet. Then he pushed the laptop toward Gavin. Show me the dependency analysis. Gavin pulled the laptop closer and started walking him through it, step by step. No shortcuts, no skipping ahead, no trust me on this part. He showed every node in the dependency chain, every relationship between the confirmation signal and the modules downstream of it, every point where a miscalibrated threshold could propagate into something larger, and exactly why in this specific architecture none of those propagation paths were active. Jason didn't say anything for almost 20 minutes. He asked one question, a sharp technical question, about a specific interaction between the output validation module and the logging layer that Gavin hadn't addressed. And Gavin stopped, looked at the question seriously, and then answered it correctly, not defensively, not dismissively, just directly, because the question was good and deserved a straight answer. After the 20 minutes, Jason sat back. If we do this, he said, I run the testing protocol myself. That's fine. If anything looks wrong at any point, we revert and go with the original build. Agreed. And this doesn't happen again. Any proposed change to this system comes through me first. Not Davis. Not Sloan. Me. Understood, Gavin said. Jason closed the laptop. Go get Davis. We start in 20 minutes. Gavin stood up. He was almost at the door when Jason spoke again. That email I sent last night. Jason wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the table. The one to the board. Gavin waited. I'll send a follow-up. Clarify that the concern has been addressed internally. A beat. That's all I'm saying about it. That's enough, Gavin said. He went to get Davis. The fix took 51 minutes to implement and 3.5 hours to test. Jason ran every test himself exactly as he'd said he would, with Davis cross-checking and Gavin watching the output data and calling out anything that needed a second look. They found nothing. The system ran cleaner after the adjustment than it had before response latency, dropping by 63 milliseconds under peak load, a number that, in a live demonstration environment with military observers actively testing reaction speeds, was the difference between impressive and unremarkable. By noon, the testing was complete. Nobody celebrated. They were professionals. But Davis allowed himself a quiet yeah when the final test results populated, and even Pritchard, who had spent the past 2 days treating Gavin like background furniture, leaned over to look at the numbers with something approaching genuine interest. Jason stood up from his workstation, stretched his back, and said to the room at large, 2-hour break, back here at 2 for full system review. He walked out without looking at Gavin. That was fine. Gavin wasn't looking for acknowledgement. He was looking at the clock. Demonstration was at 10 the next morning. 17 hours. Enough time to do a full review run, a pre-demonstration simulation sleep for 4 hours, and pick up Lena from Mrs. Carpenter's in the morning before heading to the company. He was doing the math in his head when his phone buzzed. Text from Sloan. 3 words. My office. Now. He looked at the time. 12:14. He texted back, walking up. Her door was open when he arrived. She was standing at the window again, the same position he'd found her in on his first morning, and he was beginning to understand that this was what she did when she was processing something. She stood at that window and looked out at the parking lot like it contained information. The board called me at 8 this morning, she said without turning around. After Jason's email. I figured. 3 of the 5 members want your access suspended pending a qualification review. She turned. I told them no. Gavin waited. I told them you had identified and resolved a critical latency risk in our demonstration architecture, working collaboratively with the project lead, and that the system was testing clean. She looked at him steadily. Which is true now, as of this morning. Yes. Which means that last night when Jason sent that email, it wasn't true yet. She held his gaze. What if the fix hadn't worked, Gavin? It was a fair question. He didn't dodge it. Then I'd have been wrong, he said. And Jason would have been right to push back. But it worked, and the system is cleaner than it was. And if it had failed during demonstration tomorrow, it would have failed without the fix too, he said. Just less visibly. The latency would have shown up under military load testing regardless. With the fix, we have a shot at clean results. Without it, we were accepting a known degradation and hoping the observers didn't push hard enough to surface it. Sloan was quiet for a moment. Did you know it would work when you proposed it? I was highly confident, he said. There's a difference. She almost smiled. How highly? 94%. And the remaining 6? That's why Jason ran the testing himself, Gavin said. I wanted his eyes on it. Not because I doubted the analysis, but because this is his system. He knows the interactions I don't know yet. If there'd been something wrong, he would have caught it. Sloan looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that was doing a lot of quiet work. How are you doing with all of this? She asked. Not the technical work, the rest of it. The question surprised him slightly. I'm all right. Jason's team is a difficult environment to walk into. I've walked into difficult environments. Not as the man with the mop in his personnel file, she said. He considered that. It's different, he admitted. The mop file makes it easier for people to not take me seriously, which in some ways is easier to work around than the kind of dismissal I used to get in academic settings, because it's more visible. When someone openly doesn't believe you're capable, you know what you're dealing with. It's the subtle version that's harder. Jason isn't subtle. No, Gavin said. But he's honest. I can work with honest. He paused. He's also good. The architecture he built under those constraints in that timeline, there are decisions in there that are genuinely elegant. He made good choices under pressure. That matters. Sloan looked at him. You just complimented the man who tried to have your access revoked 8 hours ago. He was protecting his project, Gavin said. I understand that. She shook her head slowly. Not in disagreement. In something closer to wonder. Get some rest tonight if you can, she said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. I know. He started to stand. Sloan. She raised an eyebrow. Thank you, he said. For this morning, with the board. She nodded once. Don't make me regret it. He walked back downstairs. The afternoon system review ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. Gavin didn't lead it. Jason led it methodically, going through every subsystem with the thoroughness of a man who had built the thing and knew exactly where it could surprise you. Gavin sat at the far end of the table and followed along, noting 2 places where the review revealed minor configuration items that were worth flagging, both of which Davis had already marked independently. At 4:47, Jason looked up from his notes. These 2 items. He pointed to the flagged configurations. Gavin, you see them? Yes. Fix or leave? Leave, Gavin said immediately. Both of them are within tolerance, and adjusting this close to demonstration introduces risk that outweighs the marginal improvement. We flag them for post-demonstration action. Jason looked at him for a beat, then agreed. He wrote something in his notebook. Anyone else have items no good? Full sim starts at 6. Be back here at 5:50. The team started moving. Reyes paused next to Gavin on her way out. Nice call on those configs, she said quietly. Yesterday you would have pushed to fix them. Gavin looked at her. What makes you say that? She smiled slightly. Just watching how you operate. She picked up her notebook. You're learning the room. Trying to, he said. It's working, she said, and left. The simulation at 6 was the full system at demonstration load. Every module active, every subsystem under stress queries, coming in at the rate they'd expect, from a room full of military observers who were testing specifically to find weak points. Jason ran it from the primary console. Gavin watched from a secondary station, tracking the output data in real time. For the first 8 minutes, everything ran clean. Then at minute 9, something changed. Not a failure. Not a crash. Something subtler. A pattern in the output data that Gavin noticed, the way you notice a word repeated too many times in a sentence. The system's response to certain query types was defaulting to a secondary processing pathway when it should have been using the primary. Not wrong exactly, just not optimal. And under military testing, not optimal was a story. He almost didn't say anything. He had promised Jason that architectural changes came through him first. This wasn't quite an architectural change. It was a routing priority, but it was close enough to the line that he felt the weight of the decision. He looked at the data for 45 more seconds. The pattern was consistent. It wasn't going away on its own. Jason, he said. Across the room, Jason didn't look up. What? Query routing, types 7 and 9. Secondary pathway. A pause. I see it. Routing priority table. Another pause. Longer. Yeah. Jason typed something, looked at his screen, typed something else. Davis, pull up the routing config. Davis pulled it up. The room was quiet. Gavin kept his eyes on his own screen, tracking the pattern, watching to see if Jason had found what he was looking for. Jason said a word under his breath that wasn't appropriate for most settings. Then, it was updated 3 days ago. Config push from the security team. It changed the routing priority for classified query types. He straightened up. It shouldn't have touched the AI routing logic. It wasn't supposed to touch it. But it did, Davis said. But it did. Jason looked at the screen for a moment. Then at Gavin. How long have you been watching this? About a minute before I said something. You waited a minute. I was making sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Jason looked at him. How long to trace the full impact of the config change? 2 hours, Gavin said. Maybe less. Do it, Jason said. I'll take the routing fix. You map the impact. Everyone else, full simulation continues. We need to know if there's anything else this change touched. The next 2 hours were the sharpest, most focused work Gavin had done in 7 years. Not because the technical problem was the hardest he'd ever faced. It wasn't, not even close, but because of what was at stake and who was in the room, and the particular quality of attention that comes when everyone around you is finally fully taking you seriously. He found 4 places where the config change had touched the AI routing logic. 3 of them were minor correctable with a routing table adjustment that Jason could implement in 20 minutes. The 4th was not minor. The 4th was a problem. The security team's configuration push had inadvertently altered the authentication handshake between the AI decision layer and the external reporting module, the module that would be generating output directly to the military observers' monitoring systems during the demonstration. If the handshake failed under load, the observers' screens would go dark mid-demonstration. Not a crash, not a visible failure, just silence, at the moment when the system was supposed to be proving what it could do. Gavin stared at his screen for 10 seconds after he confirmed it. Then he stood up. Jason. Something in his voice made Jason look up immediately. What? I need you to come look at this. Jason crossed the room, stood next to Gavin, looked at the screen. The room kept working around them. Keyboards, quiet voices, the hum of systems running. Gavin and Jason stood side by side and looked at a problem that had not been there 3 days ago, that nobody had introduced deliberately, that had arrived quietly through a routine security update, and buried itself in the handshake logic like a splinter too small to see until it was already infected. How confident are you in this analysis? Jason said quietly. 97%. And the remaining 3? Let's find the remaining 3, Gavin said. Jason straightened. Everyone stop what you're doing, he said to the room. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that everyone in the room heard and responded to. We have a priority issue. Full hands on this. Now. It took 40 minutes to confirm what Gavin had found and map every edge of it. The authentication handshake issue was real. It would surface under demonstration load, and they were 14 hours from the demonstration. At 8:53 in the evening, Jason Marlowe did something that Gavin suspected did not come easily to him. He walked to the center of the room, looked at the team and said, Gavin found it. He walks us through the fix. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned it. Nobody exchanged glances. They just turned and looked at Gavin and waited. Gavin looked back at them. 12 engineers, 11 hours, a $100 million contract, and a security team configuration push that had tried its quiet best to bring the whole thing down. He thought of Lena asleep at Mrs. Carpenter's house. He thought of the drawing in his shirt pocket, me and Dad, big son, 2 stick figures. He thought of Elaine, practical and optimistic, believing that things worked out when you did the work to make them work out. All right, he said. Here's what we're going to do. He started talking. They worked through the night. They worked through the damnedest. They worked in shifts of focus, not by assignment, not because anyone organized it that way, but because that's what a team does when the situation is serious enough to make everything else irrelevant. Someone would hit a wall mentally and step back, get coffee, walk the perimeter of the room twice, and by the time they came back, someone else had pushed the ball 6 yards further down the field. It was organic. It was the way real work actually happens, when the pressure is high enough to burn away everything performative. And Gavin had seen it before. He'd been part of it before. But not in 7 years, and not like this. Not with this particular combination of people who 3 days ago hadn't known he existed, who were now tracking his analysis on their secondary monitors and calling questions across the room like he'd been there from the beginning. The handshake fix itself was not complicated. That was the particular cruelty of it. The authentication issue that the security team's config push had introduced was at its core a sequencing problem. The reporting module was being asked to confirm authentication before the decision layer had finished initializing, which meant the handshake was reaching out to an entity that wasn't fully ready to receive it. And under load, the timing gap widened until the handshake failed silently, and the output stream to the observer's monitoring systems simply stopped. 2 lines of corrected initialization sequence. That was the fix. The problem was everything around it. Because when you changed initialization sequence in a live integrated system, you were touching the order in which every connected module came online. And when you changed that order, you potentially changed the behavior of every module that depended on something being ready before it started its own initialization. Which meant, before you touched those 2 lines, you needed to map every dependency in the initialization chain and confirm that the new sequence didn't create a different problem downstream. That mapping was the work. That was why it took all night. And Gavin ran the primary analysis. Davis ran the verification pass behind him. Reyes handled the dependency tree for the output layer, a section of the system she knew cold better than anyone in the room, and she moved through it with a quiet efficiency that Gavin noted and respected. Pritchard, who had spent 2 days treating Gavin like background furniture, was now running stress simulations against the proposed new initialization sequence without being asked, feeding results to Davis in real time because he had decided somewhere between 8 and 9 p.m. that the problem was more important than his position. Jason managed the room. That was the right word for it. Managed, not led, not directed. He moved between workstations, asked precise questions, made decisions when decisions needed making, and stayed out of the way when people were in the middle of something. He didn't stand over Gavin's shoulder. He didn't second-guess the analysis. He checked in at intervals, looked at the outputs, said, "Keep going," or "Flag that for me," or occasionally just nodded and moved on. At 11:43, Gavin found something. He almost missed it. He was 90 minutes into a dependency trace that had been clean at every step, and he was tired in the specific way that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from the sustained cognitive load of holding a complex map in your head while simultaneously extending it. He saw the flag in the output data, and his first instinct was that he'd made an error, introduced a phantom dependency somewhere upstream that was propagating through his analysis incorrectly. He stopped, backed up, checked the upstream nodes one by one. No error. The flag was real. "Jason," he said. Jason was at the other end of the room. He came without being asked twice. Stood next to Gavin, looked at the screen. "Tell me what I'm looking at," Jason said. "The new initialization sequence resolves the handshake issue," Gavin said. "But it changes the startup timing for the decision layer by approximately 40 milliseconds, which on its own is nothing. But the secondary processing pathway, the one we saw defaulting in the simulation tonight, its timeout threshold is hard-coded at a value that assumes the decision layer is ready within a specific window. And 40 milliseconds pushes it outside the window. At peak load, yes." Gavin pointed to the specific node in the dependency tree. "It won't affect standard operation, but if the military observers run high-load queries in the first 90 seconds after system initialization, which they likely will, because that's standard stress testing protocol, the secondary pathway will time out on the decision layer and fall back to its contingency output." "Which is what?" Jason asked. "A cached response set," Davis said from across the room. He'd been following along on his secondary monitor. "We use it for failsafe. It returns plausible outputs based on historical data, rather than live processing. So under high-load stress testing in the first 90 seconds, Jason said slowly, the system would appear to be responding correctly, but it would actually be returning cached data instead of live analysis. Yes, Gavin said. The room was very quiet. In front of DOD observers, Jason said. Yes. Who are specifically there to evaluate live processing capability. Yes. Jason stood with his hands on the table looking at the screen. He said nothing for almost 30 seconds. Gavin let him have the 30 seconds. This was not a moment for rushing. Options, Jason said finally. 3, Gavin said. 1. We abandon the initialization sequence fix and go with the original build. The handshake issue stays, but it only surfaces under sustained load. There's a chance the demonstration doesn't push hard enough to trigger it. He paused. I wouldn't take that chance. Neither would I, Jason said. 2. We adjust the secondary pathway timeout threshold to account for the 40 millisecond shift. It's a small change, lower risk than the initialization fix, but it requires another full dependency trace to confirm it doesn't create a third problem. How long for the trace? 2 hours, maybe 2.5. Jason looked at the clock on the wall. 11:51 p.m. Demonstration at 10 a.m. That leaves us 4 hours of testing before we need to be ready. Tight, but possible. He looked at Gavin. 3. We modify the high-load query handling in the first 90 seconds to explicitly hold the secondary pathway in standby until the decision layer confirms readiness. More complex change, higher risk, but it addresses the root behavior rather than adjusting a threshold. How long? 4 hours for implementation, another 3 for full testing. Gavin paused. We don't have that window. Option 2. Jason said immediately. He straightened up. Davis, you and Reyes run the dependency trace on the timeout adjustment. I want interim results every 30 minutes. Gavin, stay on primary analysis. I'll run the stress simulation framework in parallel so we can test the moment the trace is clean. He looked around the room. Everybody clear. The team was already moving. Gavin stayed at his station and kept working. He was running on his third coffee, and the particular clarity that comes at midnight when everything non-essential has been stripped away by fatigue and what remains is just the problem and the work. He had been in this state before. He knew how to function inside it. You narrowed your attention to the smallest actionable unit, this line, this node, this connection, and you kept moving. And at 12:37 a.m. Davis called across the room. Interim results are clean through the output layer. Keep going, Jason said. At 1:14 a.m. Reyes. Secondary pathway dependency chain is clear. Almost there, Jason said. At 1:49 a.m. Davis. Trace is complete. All nodes clean. No downstream impact. The room exhaled. Implementing the timeout adjustment, Jason said. He was already at the keyboard. Gavin, watch the primary output. Tell me the moment you see anything that doesn't look right. Watching, Gavin said. The implementation took 11 minutes. Jason's hands moved with the confidence of a man who had written this system from the ground up and knew exactly what he was touching and why. Gavin tracked the output data in real time, watching every change propagate through the connected modules, looking for the thing that shouldn't be there. Nothing. Clean. 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 It's holding, Gavin said. Starting stress simulation, Jason said. Full load. Same profile as the demonstration. The room watched. For the first 90 seconds, every set of eyes in the room was on the screens tracking the system under peak load. The exact conditions that had been the problem. The exact window where the timeout would have failed before the adjustment. The decision layer came online. The secondary pathway stood in proper standby. The handshake executed cleanly. The output stream to the simulated observer monitoring interface ran without interruption. At the 90-second mark, Davis said quietly, "We're through it." Nobody cheered. They were too tired to cheer and too professional to feel like it was over. But something moved through the room, a collective release of held breath, a small unwinding of the sustained tension that had been running through everyone's shoulders since 8:53 that evening. Jason ran the simulation for another 12 minutes before stopping it. He looked at the aggregate results, looked at them again. Then he stood up from the console and said simply, "Good work, all of you." He looked at Gavin when he said it, not pointedly, just included. It was a small thing. Gavin knew it and didn't make more of it than it was. But he also didn't make less of it. "Testing protocol," Jason said. 4-hour window. I need 3 people to stay for the full run. Volunteers. Davis's hand went up immediately. Reyes nodded. Pritchard, who could have gone home, who had already put in a brutal night, said, "I'll stay without any particular drama," and went back to his station. Jason looked at Gavin. "You should go home." Gavin looked at him. "You've got a kid," Jason said. It wasn't gentle exactly. It was factual. "You need 4 hours of sleep more than we need 4 more hours of you staring at a screen. The testing protocol is established. It doesn't need your eyes." He held Gavin's gaze. "Go home. Be back at 8:30. Gavin thought about arguing. The instinct was there, the same instinct that had kept him in labs until 2 and 3 in the morning in a different life. The belief that leaving before the work was done was a form of abandonment. But that instinct had cost him things he couldn't get back, and the man he was now knew the difference between the work that needed him and the work that would get done without him. "I'll be back at 8:15, he said. Jason almost smiled. Almost. 8:30, he said. "You're not that indispensable." Gavin drove home through empty streets, the city quiet in the particular way it only gets in the hours between when the bars close and when the first shift starts. He was at Mrs. Carpenter's door by 2:20. She answered in her robe, told him Lena had been an angel, which meant she'd been asleep since 8, and Mrs. Carpenter had spent the evening watching her shows in peace. He carried Lena home. She was 7, which was almost too old to be carried, and she didn't wake up during the transfer, not when he lifted her from the couch, not when he got her coat on, not when he carried her down the hallway to her room and laid her down and pulled the blanket up to her chin. She made a small sound, settled, kept sleeping. He stood in her doorway for a moment, and he thought about the 12 engineers in that room working through the night on something he'd helped make possible. He thought about Jason Marlowe saying, "Go home," with the same flat directness he applied to everything, and meaning it without softness, but also without malice. He thought about the demonstration at 10 a.m., the military observers, the $100 million, the 2 lines of code that had fixed a handshake issue, and the 2 more that had fixed the problem those 2 had created. He thought about how close it had all been. How many ways this could have gone wrong that nobody would have caught in time. He went to bed, set his alarm for 6:15, closed his eyes. He was asleep in 4 minutes. His phone rang at 5:47. He was sitting up before he was fully awake, heart already moving, hand already on the phone. The number was Davis's cell. "What happened?" Gavin said. Not a question. "The testing protocol." Davis's voice was controlled, but tight in a way that said he was working to keep it that way. "We're clean on everything we tested tonight, but Jason wanted to run the full observer simulation one more time at 5 a.m. Full load, full duration." A pause. "Gavin, the system failed." Gavin was already standing, already looking for his shoes. "What kind of failure?" "Not the handshake, not the timeout, something new." Davis's voice dropped. "The AI decision layer, it's returning inconsistent outputs on a specific subset of queries. Not wrong outputs, inconsistent ones. Same query, 2 different answers, 30 seconds apart." Gavin stopped. His mind was already running the architecture, already looking for where that failure mode could come from. "Is it deterministic?" "We can't tell yet. It's the pattern is irregular." "I'm coming in. Jason said not to call you." Gavin paused. "Why are you calling me?" A short silence. Because Jason's been staring at it for 40 minutes and I've never seen him look like this before. Another pause. He looks scared, Gavin. Gavin was in his car in 6 minutes. He texted Mrs. Carpenter, emergency at work. Can you take Lena at 7? I'll explain later. She replied in under a minute. Of course. Go. He drove. The engineering bay at 6:07 a.m. had the specific atmosphere of a room where people have been awake too long and found something they didn't expect to find. Davis met him at the door. Reyes was at her station working quietly with the focused expression of someone who had moved past panic into the grim efficiency that panic leaves behind. Pritchard was running output comparisons on a secondary screen, his face unreadable. Jason was at the primary console. He looked up when Gavin walked in. He did not say anything about the fact that Gavin was there 2 hours and 23 minutes before he'd told him to be. Show me, Gavin said. Jason moved aside. Gavin sat down, looked at the output logs from the 5 a.m. simulation, looked at the inconsistent responses, looked at the timing pattern between them. He felt something go quiet inside him. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind that comes when you recognize something you've seen before and didn't expect to see again. Pull up the system's training data configuration, he said. Jason leaned forward. Why? Because this inconsistency pattern, Gavin pointed to the output log. It's not a code issue, it's not an integration issue, it's a data issue. The decision layer is getting conflicting weighted inputs from 2 different training sets and alternating between them. He looked at Jason. When did you last update the AI's training configuration? Jason's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. 3 weeks ago. Pre-demonstration update. Standard procedure. Was the update validated against the full query set? A pause. Longer than it should have been. It was validated against the standard validation suite. Not the full query set. Jason said nothing. Jason, Gavin kept his voice level. Was the training update validated against the military query profile specifically? The military query profile wasn't finalized until 2 weeks ago, Jason said. His voice was quiet. The training update was done before we had it. The room was very still. Gavin turned back to the screen. He was running calculations in his head not from panic, but from the same focused clarity that had been carrying him all night. The training configuration conflict was the root. The inconsistent outputs were the symptom. The question was whether the conflict could be resolved in 3 hours and 47 minutes. How many conflicting weighted inputs? Jason asked. I need to map it, Gavin said. Give me 30 minutes. We have less than 4 hours. I know how much time we have. Gavin was already working. 30 minutes. He mapped it in 22. The conflict was between the original training sets waiting for a specific category of high-priority threat assessment queries and the updated training sets different waiting for the same category. The system couldn't resolve the conflict autonomously because neither waiting had priority designation. They were equal in the configuration file, which meant the decision layer was alternating between them based on processing sequence, which varied under load. The fix was not 2 lines of code. The fix was a priority designation in the training configuration file, a single parameter change that told the system which waiting to treat as authoritative for that query category, plus a cache flush to clear any intermediate states that had already been influenced by the conflict. 40 minutes of work, 90 minutes of validation testing. Can we do it? Jason said. Yes, Gavin said. If the validation testing finds a third problem, then we have 2 hours to solve a third problem, Gavin said. We don't have the option of not trying. Jason looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face had changed over the course of the night, not softened exactly because Jason Marlowe wasn't a soft man, and wasn't going to become one, but settled. The particular settlement of a person who has decided something and stopped fighting the decision. Do it, he said, and Gavin implemented the priority designation in 8 minutes. The cache flush ran automatically. The validation testing started at 6:49 a.m. At 7:53 a.m., the final validation test cleared. Davis said yes out loud, a single syllable, emphatic. Reyes put both hands flat on her desk. Pritchard leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Jason stood up. He was looking at the system output with the expression of a man who has just watched something he built get better than it was. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he turned to Gavin. "Go get cleaned up," he said. "You've got an hour and 5 minutes." Gavin almost laughed. "I don't have a change of clothes here. Davis has a spare jacket in his locker. It'll be too big for you. Wear it anyway." Jason picked up his phone. "The board and the military observers arrive at 9:30. Sloan wants us in the conference hall by 9. He started typing. "Go." "Sorry." Gavin stood. He was running on 3 hours of sleep and more coffee than was reasonable, and the specific kind of energy that has no physical source. The energy that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're built to do. He went to find Davis's jacket. Behind him, Jason Marlowe sent an email to the full board of directors and Sloan Mercer. The subject line read, "System Status Demonstration Ready." In the body, "All critical issues resolved. Team performed exceptionally. We are ready." He did not mention whose analysis had found the issues. He did not mention who had worked through the night. He didn't need to. Sloan had the security footage. The timestamps were in the system logs. The record was the record. What he wrote at the bottom in the last line before his signature was this: "Recommend full team recognition following successful demonstration." Bah. It was the closest thing to an apology Jason Marlowe was capable of constructing. Anyone who knew him would have understood it immediately. Gavin understood it when Sloan forwarded him the email at 8:09 a.m. standing in the men's room in Davis's jacket that was in fact too big for him by about an inch in the shoulders and 3 inches in the sleeve. He read it once, put his phone in his pocket, looked at himself in the mirror. Metoy. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been awake most of the night wearing someone else's jacket, about to walk into the most important professional moment he'd had in 7 years. Elaine would have found this funny. The jacket especially. He thought about her laugh, the real one, not the polite one. The one that started somewhere in her chest and arrived at her face faster than she could stop it. He thought about how she would have described this moment to her sister on the phone. You should have seen him standing there in this jacket that was 3 sizes too big, about to go present to the Department of Defense. He looked ridiculous. He looked perfect. "Okay," he said to the mirror. He straightened the jacket as much as it was going to straighten. He walked out of the men's room. He went to the conference hall. The military observers were already arriving. The conference hall at 9:22 a.m. had the particular energy of a room where the stakes are visible on every face. 4 military observers in uniform sat at the primary evaluation table, tablets, open pens ready. 2 of them were colonels, Gavin could tell by the insignia, without needing to look twice, a reflex from years of government briefings that hadn't gone away despite everything. Behind them, 3 members of the Mercer Dynamics board occupied chairs they clearly wished were further from the front. 2 DoD contract administrators sat to the right with laptops and expressions that suggested they had seen many demonstrations and been impressed by very few. Sloan was at the front of the room, talking to the lead colonel, a broad-shouldered woman named Hargrove, who carried the specific stillness of someone who had made consequential decisions under pressure for so long it had become her resting state. Sloan was composed, precise, the version of herself she deployed when the situation required her to be the steadiest thing in the room. Gavin stood near the back with Davis, who had changed his shirt, but not much else, and who was holding a coffee cup with both hands like it was keeping him upright, which it probably was. Jason came in from the side door at 9:26. He looked at Gavin across the room. Gavin looked back. Something passed between them that didn't need words, the particular understanding of 2 people who have been awake all night solving problems together and arrived at the morning still standing. Jason nodded once. Gavin nodded back. Sloane called the room to attention at 9:30 exactly. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "We're going to keep the introduction brief because what we have to show you is better than anything I can say about it." The Mercer Dynamics Adaptive AI Integration System has been designed specifically to address the decision support requirements outlined in the RFP, and our lead systems consultant will be walking you through the demonstration today. She looked toward the back of the room. "Gavin Brooks." The whispers started before he reached the front. Not the loud open laughter of that first night in the engineering lab. This was subtler. The board members exchanging glances, one of the contract administrators leaning toward the other and saying something behind his hand. A colonel looking at Sloane with an expression that asked a question without being rude enough to say it out loud. Davis's jacket still didn't fit perfectly. Gavin was aware of that. He was aware of the 3 hours of sleep and the coffee and adrenaline combination that was currently passing for energy in his body. He was aware that he was walking to the front of a room that contained people whose collective professional judgment of him had been formed in the last 30 seconds and was not at this moment particularly favorable. He reached the presentation console, looked at the room, took one breath, and then he did the thing that nobody in that room expected. He didn't open with technical specifications. He didn't advance to the first slide. He set his notes face down on the console, and he said, "Before I show you what this system does, I want to tell you how it thinks, because I think that's the more important question." Colonel Hargrove, who had been writing something on her tablet, stopped writing. She looked up. "The system you're going to evaluate today," Gavin continued, "is built around a fundamental premise about how human beings make decisions under pressure. Not how we think we make them, how we actually make them." He paused. "I have a 7-year-old daughter named Lena. 2 weeks ago she came home from school and told me that her teacher had said computers don't make mistakes, they just do what they're told. And Lena told her teacher, what if what they're told is wrong? Nobody was writing anything." The board members had stopped exchanging glances. "That's the problem this system is designed to solve," Gavin said. "Not computing power, not processing speed. The problem of a system that does exactly what it's told, even when what it's told is wrong, and the question of how you build something that can recognize the difference." He looked at Hargrove directly. "That's what I'm going to show you today." Hargrove set her pen down. "Go ahead, Mr. Brooks." He ran the demonstration. He had spent the early part of the night before the 5 a.m. crisis, before the training data conflict, before the final sprint to the finish, thinking about how to present this system to people who were not AI engineers, who were military professionals, evaluating a tool they would potentially use to make real decisions in real situations where being wrong had consequences that showed up in casualty reports. He had thought about how to make it real for them instead of technical. When he presented it through scenarios. Not abstract test cases, actual operational scenarios drawn from the DoD's own published doctrine, structured as the kind of decision support problems that people in this room had either faced themselves or commanded people who had. He framed each scenario in plain language, ran the system query live, and then walked through the output in the same plain language, explaining not just what the system had concluded, but how it had weighted the inputs, what it had flagged as uncertain, where it had identified conflicting information, and why it had resolved the conflict the way it did. The first scenario ran clean. The output was precise, appropriately hedged on the uncertain elements, and faster than the stated response benchmark by 17%. The second scenario was a stress test, a deliberately complex query with conflicting inputs and an embedded data anomaly that the DoD evaluators had designed specifically to catch systems that handled ambiguity poorly. Gavin knew about the embedded anomaly because Hargrove's team had submitted it as part of the evaluation package, and he had spent 40 minutes the previous afternoon thinking about exactly how the system should handle it. The system flagged the anomaly explicitly, with a confidence-weighted notation that identified the specific data point as statistically inconsistent with the surrounding information set, and recommended treating the output as provisional pending verification. Hargrove leaned forward. "Run that back," she said. Gavin ran it back. She looked at the output flag for a long moment. Then she said to the administrator beside her in a voice that wasn't meant to carry, but did, "That's the first system that's ever caught that anomaly." Why? The third scenario was the hardest. Gavin had known it was coming. It was in the evaluation package, and he had specifically not told the engineering team the details of it because he wanted the system to face it cold under live conditions, the same way it would face unexpected situations in actual deployment. It was a cascading decision tree with 7 interdependent variables and a time compression element that required the system to update its output in real time as new information was introduced at 30-second intervals. And he started the query. Introduce the first variable. Watch the output. Introduce the second. At the 4th variable, the room had gone completely still. At the 6th, Colonel Hargrove had her pen in her hand again, but wasn't writing. She was holding it, watching the screen with the focused attention of someone witnessing something being done well. At the 7th variable, the system resolved the full decision tree and generated a complete output recommendation with confidence weighting uncertainty flags, and a decision rationale that traced every step of its reasoning in language a non-engineer could follow. The time on the counter read 4 minutes and 11 seconds from query initiation to complete output. The benchmark was 8 minutes. The room was quiet. Then one of the other colonels, a younger man with a careful face, who had not said a single word since the demonstration began, said, "Can you run it again? Different variable sequence." "Yes," Gavin said. He ran it again. Different sequence, same variables. The system adapted. Different weighting, different pathway through the decision tree, same quality of output. The colonel looked at his tablet, looked at the screen, looked at Gavin. "How? The system isn't following a fixed decision tree," Gavin said. "It's modeling the decision-making process itself, the way a human expert would. It builds the tree based on the variables as they arrive, which means the sequence changes the path, but not the quality of the reasoning." He paused. The difference between a system that has memorized the map and a system that understands why the roads are where they are. The colonel wrote something on his tablet. Then he looked up. "My daughter asks questions like that." Gavin blinked. "The map and the roads thing," the colonel said. He almost smiled. "She's 9. She would have asked it exactly like that." Something shifted in the room. Small but real, the kind of shift that happens when a room full of professionals remembers simultaneously that they are also human beings. "One more scenario," Hargrove said. "Not from the evaluation package." Gavin looked at her. "All right." She described it verbally, a complex, layered threat assessment scenario that she constructed on the spot, specific enough that Gavin could tell it was drawn from real experience, from something she had actually faced or come close to facing. It was the kind of scenario that lived in the memory of someone who had been in the field. It had the texture of truth. Gavin entered it into the system exactly as she described it. The system ran for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The output came back with a primary recommendation, 3 alternative scenarios, ranked by probability. A specific flag on the second alternative, marked as the highest variance outcome, and a notation that 2 of the input parameters were approaching the boundary of the system's validated training range, and that outputs in this region should be reviewed by a subject matter expert before action. Hargrove read it again. She set her tablet down on the table and looked at Gavin. "The flag on the second alternative," she said, "and the boundary notation." "Yes," Gavin said. "Most systems in this category suppress those flags. They generate clean output, because clean output is what evaluators expect." "I know," Gavin said. "Why doesn't this one?" Gavin thought about Lena. About what if what they're told is wrong. About a 7-year-old who had already understood at 7 that the honest answer and the comfortable answer are not always the same thing, and that the honest one is more useful even when it's harder to hear. "Because a system that tells you what you want to hear," he said, "is more dangerous than no system at all. The flags are the point. The boundary notation is the point. The value isn't in the confidence, it's in the system knowing the limits of its own confidence. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up. She didn't say anything to her team. She didn't need to. The two colonels exchanged a look that was its own conversation. The contract administrators both had their laptops open and were typing. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," Hargrove said. She extended her hand. He shook it. "We'll have a preliminary determination by end of business today," she said. Sloane, from the side of the room, said nothing. But Gavin caught her expression, the controlled professional expression of a woman who had been running a company for 11 years and knew how to read a room and who was reading this one clearly. The observers filed out at 11:43 a.m. The room after they left was briefly the loudest it had ever been, and Davis said something that was mostly unintelligible but communicated pure relief. Reyes put her hands over her face. Even Pritchard, composed Pritchard, who had spent 2 days treating Gavin like furniture, and the entire previous night running stress simulations without complaint, turned to Davis and shook his hand with both of his, which was as much celebration as Pritchard was apparently capable of expressing. Jason stood apart from the group as he always did. He was looking at the presentation screen, which still showed the last output from the Hargrove scenario. His arms were crossed. His face was doing something complicated. Gavin walked over. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "The boundary notation," Jason said finally. "That was your idea." "The flag logic was already in the system," Gavin said. "I just made sure it wasn't suppressed in the demonstration output." Jason turned to look at him. "It almost wasn't. 3 weeks ago there was a discussion about cleaning up the output format before the demonstration, making it read cleaner." He paused. "I was in favor of it." "What changed your mind?" "Davis made an argument about intellectual honesty that I thought was naive at the time," Jason said. "I overruled him, and then I thought about it for another week and changed my mind without telling him." He looked back at the screen. "He doesn't know I changed it back." "You should tell him," Gavin said. A short silence. "Maybe," Jason said, which from Jason was approximately the same as yes. Gavin's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Text from Mrs. Carpenter. "Lena wants to know if everything went okay. She made you a card." He looked at that message for a moment. Something moved through him that wasn't the adrenaline or the sleep deprivation or the particular exhaustion of sustained high-stakes focus. Something quieter, warmer. He typed back, "Tell her yes. Everything went okay. I'll be there by 2. He put the phone in his pocket. Sloane appeared at his elbow. "Walk with me," she said. They walked out of the conference hall down the corridor to the window at the end that looked out over the parking lot. The same window she stood at when she was thinking. She stood at it now, and he stood beside her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, because the morning had been a lot, and sometimes a moment of nothing is exactly right. "They're going to approve the contract," she said. "You don't know that yet," he said. "I've been in enough of those rooms," she said. Hargrove shook your hand. She doesn't shake hands with presenters who didn't earn it. She looked out the window. "We're going to get the contract." Gavin was quiet. "I want to talk about what comes next," Sloane said. "I figured. I want to offer you a permanent role. Not a consulting arrangement. A position." She turned to look at him. "Director of Systems Integration and Research. You would lead the team that bridges the research side and the implementation side, the part of the process where good ideas go to die, because nobody speaks both languages fluently." "That's a real problem in this building," Gavin said. "It's a real problem in every building like this one," Sloane said. "You speak both languages. You proved that this week." She paused. "The compensation would be commensurate. The title would be commensurate. And I want to build the role around your actual life, not around the assumption that your actual life doesn't exist." Gavin looked at her. "What does that mean practically?" It means the role is scoped so that you can pick up your daughter from school, Sloan said simply. Not every day. There will be demanding periods. But as the default, as the structure, yes. It means the work is important enough that it needs to be done well, and doing it well means the person doing it needs to not be running on empty all the time. She held his gaze. I watched what you did this week. The technical work is extraordinary. But watching you manage Jason, manage the team, manage yourself under that kind of pressure, that's the rarer thing. Gavin looked out the window. The parking lot. A Tuesday morning, cars pulling in, people starting their regular days. He thought about the 14 months pushing a mop through these hallways. He thought about the night he'd walked into Lab 4 and fixed a token queue error in under 5 minutes, and then walked back out and kept working. He thought about the part of himself he'd been carrying in storage for 7 years, not gone, just shelved, waiting with the patience of something that knew it would eventually be needed again. He thought about Elaine. About what she had said to him once early in their marriage when he was agonizing over a career decision with far lower stakes than this one, Gavin. You're not choosing between your work and your life. You're trying to figure out how to make them the same thing. That's harder, but it's the only version worth trying for. I have one condition, he said. Tell me. Davis gets a formal promotion. He's been doing senior work at a mid-level salary for 18 months. That needs to be corrected. Sloan studied him. That's your condition. And Reyes gets a project lead designation. She's ready for it. She's been ready for 6 months. Those are 2 conditions. I'm aware, Gavin said. Sloan almost smiled. The real smile, not the professional one. Done, she said. Both of them. She extended her hand. Do we have an agreement? And he shook it. Her hand was firm. So was his. One more thing, she said before she let go. That jacket is terrible on you. He looked down at Davis's jacket, which had not improved over the course of the morning. I'm aware of that too, he said. She laughed. He laughed. They stood at the window for another moment, and the parking lot was just a parking lot, and the morning was just a morning. And somewhere across the city, a 7-year-old girl named Lena was finishing her lunch at school, not knowing that her father had just changed both their lives. The preliminary contract determination came in at 4:51 p.m. Approved. Full scope. 5-year agreement. Gavin was at the school gate at 3:15 when Lena came out. She was carrying the card she'd made, construction paper folded in half, covered in careful drawings that he didn't try to interpret before he was handed them, because Lena preferred to explain her own art. She ran to him the way she always did, backpack bouncing, and he crouched down, and she crashed into him, and he held on for a moment longer than usual because he was tired, and she was exactly what tired needed. Did everything go okay? She asked into his shoulder. Everything went okay, he said. She pulled back and looked at his face the way she always did, seriously searching the way children look at adults when they're deciding whether the adult is telling the truth or the comfortable version of it. She had been doing this since she was 4. He had never been able to get away with the comfortable version. She looked at him. He looked back. Really okay, she said. Really okay, he said. She handed him the card. On the front she had drawn 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of a building that was either a house or a very square tree. It was hard to tell. Inside, in her careful handwriting, she had written, to Dad, "You are the smartest person I know. Love, Lena." He read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket next to the one from before where it fit perfectly. "Come on," he said, standing up. "Bookstore." Her face lit up. "Bookstore." They walked. The afternoon was the kind that arrives in early fall sometimes when the air has just enough chill to be pleasant, and the light comes in at the angle that makes everything look like it's worth paying attention to. Lena talked about her day, a project about the solar system, a disagreement with a classmate about whether Pluto counted a song they'd learned that she couldn't stop humming. Gavin listened. He answered the Pluto question with the appropriate nuance, which Lena accepted as evidence that Pluto had been treated unfairly, and she intended to write a letter about it. He agreed that letters were a good approach to injustice. At the bookstore window, she pressed her face against the glass to look at the new display. There was a book about deep-sea creatures that she immediately needed, which they went inside and bought, and which she began reading on the sidewalk before they had walked half a block. "Dad," she said, reading and walking simultaneously, in the way that should have been dangerous, but never was, because she had the spatial awareness of someone who had been doing it since she could read. "Yeah. Do you think the fish in the really deep part of the ocean know that the top part exists?" He considered it. "Probably not." "That's sad," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they've just built a really good life down there." She thought about it. "Both can be true," she decided. "Yeah," he said. "Both can be true." They walked home in the light, Lena reading about creatures that lived in the dark, and knew nothing about the surface, Gavin walking beside her with both cards in his pocket, and a job that was going to let him keep doing exactly this afternoon after afternoon for as long as she needed him at that gate. The man who had once been erased by grief and rebuilt himself from the ground up, who had spent 14 months invisible in the hallways of a building that now had his name in a formal offer letter, walked his daughter home through an ordinary afternoon that was in every way that mattered extraordinary. He had not saved himself by becoming someone new. He had saved himself by refusing to let grief make him forget who he already was, a man who could hold an architecture in his head and explain it through stories about his daughter, who could fix a system in under 5 minutes, and then go pick up a 7-year-old who thought Pluto deserved an apology letter, who understood that the honest answer and the comfortable answer were not the same thing, and that the honest one was more useful even when it was harder to hear. Some people move through the world and leave no mark. Some people move through the world and change it without ever raising their voice. Gavin Brooks had spent 7 years becoming invisible by choice, and then, one ordinary Tuesday night at 11:47 p.m., with a mop in his hand and a cascade failure on the screen, he had simply stopped. He had walked into the room. He had done the work. The rest had followed, not because the world is fair, not because talent is always recognized, but because some problems are honest, and honest problems in the end go looking for the person who can solve them. They found him in the hallway. He was ready.